Bill, thank you for joining us. And you're speaking for the Associated Industries.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, let's begin then.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Bill Driscoll with Associated Industries of Vermont. Appreciate the opportunity to start the conversation about this bill. As I've said before, I've worked on PFAS-related legislation for a number of years now. And although obviously without the actual proposed language, it's hard to talk to specifics, but I'm happy to kind of flag or raise some considerations or issues for you to think about as you consider whether or how to go forward. Then we'd be happy to come back as that process might continue. I think some of the questions have already sort of come up. I mean, whenever you're looking at a product bill, you need to look at scope. And so the scope for pesticides is always kind of interesting. You folks are probably frankly more on top of this than some other committees that have brought up a bill that involves the word pesticide. Pesticide has a very broad meaning from agricultural applications to your antibacterial soap and a lot of things in between. So you might want to think about, what in the universe of pesticides you're trying to address. Then again, the constant question of how are you going to define the universe of PFAS, and that can often have implications just in terms of requiring, say testing for types of PFAS that are not likely to even be in the given product just because of the nature of the product and how PFAS is used in it, or not all PFAS is the same in terms of health or environmental concerns. So that's something to consider. And especially a lot of the products that Vermont has acted on, they're ones where industry has actively been working toward removing PFAS to the extent that they can. I don't think there's an industry out there that isn't trying to get rid of PFAS if it's possible. And that's often a question of timing, of finding alternatives that are not I think the technical euphemism is a regrettable substitution. You don't want to try to get rid of one chemical by using another one and then find out that that's as bad or worse. So that can take time. So there are issues like that. So I think it'd be good to get more of information as to where the pesticide industry is headed towards in terms of finding alternatives where PFAS is actually used. I don't have a lot of that information today, but certainly can help try to get that for the committee moving forward. And then there's a couple of issues that kind of also get around is what's actually achievable, what can be done. And this can get into the intentional use consideration. In other words, because PFAS can be fairly pervasive, even in very, very small levels, but if you're looking at simply the presence of PFAS in a given product, there may be sources that are simply not in the control of a manufacturer. So you have to take that into consideration as well. You may want to look at what are the levels of contamination and whether there are concern, whether the levels present are of concern, or if that should be factored into what your limits are. Even like water quality standards have standards. So you look at that. It's important to have a provision for unavoidable use. If you look at the more aggressive states like Maine or Minnesota in terms of the scope and breadth of their legislation, they still have provisions in there where if you demonstrate that there simply isn't a good alternative to meet either the consumer need or the safety and quality of a product, there are mechanisms to get an exemption for an unavoidable use. That's important to factor into this as well. In terms of what's out there in terms of looking at other states, other examples, I understand that Maine does explicitly address pesticides. Minnesota, I don't know if Minnesota explicitly addressed pesticides or if it's swept up into more general product provisions. It'd be good to get more information of Maine's experience so far. I know that it's my understanding that their pesticide provisions have raised a number of concerns. Maine has had to amend a number of different PFAS related bills in recent years because they frankly kind of got they were sort of the first ones to do stuff, and they were fairly far reaching at first, and it just wasn't workable, and they've had to kind of go walk back some things. So it'd be good to maybe get a good understanding of where they're at with PFAS, and with a date like 2030 might even be, I know a lot of people like to do stuff, but watching what happens in Maine could be a good lesson for Vermont. And of course, also, similar to the conversations we were having recently about, making sure that, there's a good market mass out there in terms of the number of states or the federal government setting some restrictions or requirements so that, Vermont or a small number of states isn't overly isolated in terms of the national market, in terms of what manufacturers have to do in terms of availability in the marketplace. It's a factor to consider. And then I guess I would also just note. Oh, sure.
Michael, I could just while you're crossing this about it, Bill, I just wondered if at the EPA or even in the industry have PFAS chemicals gotten to a point where there's safe below this many parts per billion, or is it more like we heard with infant formula and baby food with lead that there's no really acceptable bioaccumulation?
Well, there are products where even lead the product isn't banned just because there's lead in it.
Right, but
that's what I was talking about.
Inspired to have
right, yeah. So certainly there are EPA standards for PFAS in water. And that's Vermont has tried to track. It's changed over recent years, so I don't know which one is. I can't remember off the top of my head whether Vermont and the EPA are kind of on the same point now with drinking water, or if Vermont's more strict. But so there are levels like that. I don't. I would have to check in terms of specific PFAS levels for food, for example, or I imagine that there may be, but I don't know if there are off the top of my head. But that actually kind of segues into the other thing I was just going to observe, part of what I was going to observe in terms of what Vermont has been doing or is doing. So again, PFAS has been the primary chemical of concern and discussion for a number of years now. There have been a couple of rounds of reports charged to ANR and other agencies, including AG, I believe, in terms of looking at various issues and coming up with recommendations as to what to do. And I know that pesticides has come up in the past. I think one of the more recent rounds that led to the most recent major legislation last year, the charge of what to look at included consumer products, including specifically also including pesticides. And this sort of a ban was not included in what was ultimately recommended, and certainly not what was ultimately passed. What was passed, though, in last year's legislation was two things. One, a report next year as to what other states are doing or other jurisdictions are doing to address PFAS in food, which obviously is, part of, I would assume, a major part of the potential, intent of this legislation. And then I think the Agency of Agriculture is supposed to come up with actual recommendations of how to address PFAS in food. Now, I think that's not until 2033 right now, but that's in line with where other states and the EU are kind of looking at in terms of big PFAS milestones. It's kind of like the early 30s. So there is, so PFAS, so pesticides and PFAS, it is sort of it has received attention. It has been worked into sort of our broader question of where do we expand PFAS regulations beyond what we have already. So in that context might be worth taking into consideration, including maybe checking with ANR and AG as to what has gone into their consideration and recommendations to date.
Representative Lipsky had
Sure.
earlier.
Yeah, Bill, thank you. You heard the testimony on PFAS and foods, food packaging. It was alarming, but my question is the associated industries of Vermont. I'm trying to picture your concern, and I'm thinking about industrial, whether it's gas lines or
Mhm.
sewer pipe or water pipe or bridge construction. So I just asked you what the Associated Industries of Vermont's area of concern is. It pesticides, or is it in the product that you may use for piping,
Mhm.
whether it's sewer plants, water?
Well, I mean, our core membership is manufacturing in the manufacturing sector, and we obviously advocate first and foremost for Vermont-based manufacturing, but also manufacturing in general. So especially depending on how you define pesticides, I guess I would need a definition of what you're looking at before I could tell you like how many Vermont companies may be implicated in the manufacture of pesticides. And obviously pesticides, the availability and use of pesticides has a major agricultural impact, and agricultural products are a big concern of, people don't usually think about food manufacturing, but food is a manufactured product. And so we're interested in that. Yeah. I guess the only other issue I would flag is specifically with regard to packaging and the use of PFAS in packaging. Fluorinated containers has definitely been an issue of discussion. Again, I think Maine is it was the first state to have provisions to ban PFAS in containers. However, that's just sort of in two stages. The initial stage was in packaging that was used for covered products. So say, for example, cosmetics. If you have a PFAS ban in cosmetics, there was also then an associated ban of PFAS in packaging for cosmetics, even if there's no PFAS in the cosmetic itself, because it was a category. And then Maine has I think it got pushed back to 2032, sort of a broad PFAS and products, much broader PFAS and products ban, which would incorporate packaging. Vermont kind of followed that a bit. We have a ban on fluorinated packaging for our identified listed products, which I believe takes effect next year. And then a broader ban in 2032 of any fluorinated packaging. That being said, that's not necessarily a settled issue on a couple of levels. One, Maine has a unavoidable use exemption, and also, I believe, an exemption for federally regulated uses. And a lot of one of the big things about fluorinated packaging is it's in some ways the only sort of practical way to meet federal transportation safety guidelines. But putting that aside, Vermont doesn't have that exemption, so that's going to be an issue I think we're going to have to deal with, especially as we get closer to 2032. So I think it's an open question whether there needs to be more work done on fluorinated containers. And it comes down to comes down to sort of the concept of unavoidable use, because one of the uses for fluorinated containers, Representative Bartholomew, is a lot of it has to do with the nature of what is being contained, either because it's caustic or things like that. You want the container to survive. You also want to prevent contamination one way or the other, either contamination of the contained product getting out, or the product inside getting contaminated by outside contaminants. And in some cases, a fluorinated container is really the only practical way to do that. Some people might say, like, well, you can use glass or metal. I think we can imagine the transportation costs or the breaking hazards of some of those other alternatives. Which is not to say that that's never going to change, or the people aren't looking for alternatives. It's just we're probably a ways out. I think I don't think it's a direct subject to me refreshing and checking. For example, I think one of the reasons why our bill last year said, I think 2032 for a Vermont ban on fluorinated containers is kind of in line with like what the Europeans are looking at and some other folks like that. So it's not a simple prospect to simply say we're going to ban PFAS in containers and not have some unintended consequences. So.
When you were mentioning, Bill, that generally speaking, industries are trying to find substitutes and been working. I am, if I'm remembering correctly, though, reminded of a campaign to, I think it was effective in the end, to counter California's ban on PFAS and cookware.
Mhm.
But enlisted a number of celebrity chefs who use a brand of cookware that is coated with a PFAS material, saying you can't do this because nobody will be able to cook dinner anymore. If you say Teflon or whatever the product is prohibited. And I think that ultimately they were successful in getting the governor to veto that bill in California, I think. In any case,
Well, I can,
yeah, please, if you know the facts there.
well, I just know the issue, and that's also kind of a sticking point here in Vermont. We did kind of extend out so we have a cookware ban, but it's been pushed out a little bit later than some other products. And that's sort of that's a kind of a reflection of actually the changes that industries have made. Whereas the PFAS that is used in nonstick cookware today is not the same as what was used back in the Teflon days. I think it's primarily, well, I won't say primarily. For example, like PTFE or fluoropolymers that are used in cookware simply do not have the human health or environmental health impacts of the PFAS that was used in the past. So I guess that's kind of an example of kind of a Venn diagram of some of all these things. One, there has been change in industry in terms of trying to address the concerns with the PFAS that was used previously. And then there are questions of the alternatives to fluoropolymers for nonstick applications in terms of effectiveness and durability and things like that. You know, there's a discussion to be had there, which is why there are a couple of states that have banned PFAS in cookware, but there are other states that have considered it and not done it, not just California. So
Thank you for that. And just to refresh our memories, Vermont did enact last year legislation that phases out for cookware,
yes, yeah,
but not until
29 maybe. I got to double check.
some future date.
It's a couple of years later than some of the other products that we're covering. Yeah.
Somebody had a hand up. Representative O'Brien.
I was just gonna ask what it fluorinated, but I was just looking it up. But what's HDPE plastic? Is it like what we find in like
Well, it's high density something ethylene, I would guess, just
Polyethylene,
yeah.
like milk jugs and orange jugs, all the way to like oil forks and
Could be, I would have to,
cat litter? I
I
mean,
would have to check. I don't.
okay, but that really heavy duty plastic.
Yeah, I would have to,
Okay,
there are so many, yeah, I'm not a, was it a materials engineer? So I don't want to take too many guesses in terms of specific chemicals and applications per se. Yeah.
or by class, like if we do number 2 plastics, because we're all,
Yeah.
in the world, but if that
I think,
correlates with fluorinated.
yeah, I think that HDPE is milk jugs.
Right.
Okay.
I don't know if that's when people talk about fluorinated containers, I think they're more often thinking about transporting stuff other than a little more heavy duty than milk per se. But yeah. And I think obviously pesticides by their nature, you have to have a higher level of containment.
So we'll get Ledge Council in next week to go over the legislation that we've passed and look at what products have been affected, what specific, so in terms of definitions and scope, what products, but also what PFAS associated with those products, just so we have that information. And then the timing, because some of it hasn't happened yet, it's being phased into the future. I was asked earlier, why did I introduce this bill? Where did it come from? And it was a reporter actually who reached out to me after there was conversation happening down in Bennington County recently about PFAS in groundwater and drinking water, and how we've talked in this committee about PFAS in sludge and applying it onto farm fields is problematic. There's an issue with the landfills And I think generally the direction of some of those conversations has been, we're spending an awful lot of money collectively to deal with water and providing alternatives to communities that have water that's affected. We ought to be stepping back and trying to remove these chemicals from the systems before it gets to them. So that was sort of the impetus here. And then the reporter pointed out that we had passed a bill a couple of years ago that directed ANR to look specifically at this issue and report on it to the legislature. And nearly as I could tell in that report, which dealt with consumer products, there was nothing in the report specifically about pesticides or packaging. They had concluded that we shouldn't, and I think this makes sense, define pesticides as a consumer product. We don't typically go into the store to buy some of the things that are used in agriculture. But there, as we just heard about, fleet collars. Yeah, yes, right, typically. So in any case, I think that we want to establish, yes, what has happened, what might be coming. So thank you for pointing that out, Bill. Even if it's not until 2033, which seems like a long time from now, it will be good to know what the legislature has done. So we'll get clarification on that. Hear from toxicologists and others. And if you want to pass along any other industry that might be interested in testifying, we're happy to have that too, Bill.
Sure, absolutely.
Representative Lipstein.
Yeah, Chairman, I'm going back to bienniums, but when I first got elected, the DPW director in my district said, Jed, I'd like to meet with you, go to the sewer plant, go on, and back in the municipal water system. And I didn't get a bachelor's degree, but I learned more in those 5 hours with this engineer than I had in the first 76 years of my life. And back then, while Bill is still here and Barm is gone, but he said the EPA had set a standard of, I believe it was 18 or 20 parts per billion was acceptable of PFAS in drinking water. And then he said and Stowe at that time, I think, was 5 or 6 parts per billion. He said, but now the EPA is planning to lower it to 3 or 4 parts per billion. So you get a lot of, I remember these numbers because I got on the Zoom before I was ever sworn in, and Secretary Moore was on there, and I brought up the PFAS issue, and it was a question that the EPA was going to say 0 parts per billion was acceptable. So I'm fast forwarding, we're in a new administration that seems to have let go a lot of EPA personnel, or all sorts of personnel that look out for public health and safety, and EPA is one of those agencies, but it's been diminished. So the bill, or does anyone here today, to your point of, has the ANR actually come up with a standard?
Yeah.
Such a big issue that
So I think we can, Bill, you're
One
welcome
quiet.
to jump in, but I can say, just because I was following it closely, that yes, ANR came up with new rules over the fall. They are in place now. And this is for a small set, 5 or 6 PFAS compounds that are commonly found unfortunately, in water, drinking water, groundwater. And that Vermont has taken a pretty aggressive step and lowered that threshold to 4, in some cases, parts per trillion.
per trillion.
Per trillion, yeah. But Patricia, while we're thinking about this, it might be helpful to invite the agency in to speak to that. and we can talk later on about who that might be.
Okay, sure, noted.
Um, Bill, anything else to add?
No, I mean, I think, the other context, I guess I would bring up is, obviously pesticides are very, very heavily regulated at the federal level. And so both how well regulated they are and whether there are preemption issues is something to look into. I think the previous witness, said that, there aren't specific PFAS per se regulations as much, although I'm not sure how true that is, but whether it's from PFAS or any other chemical or use, and obviously the impact on food safety and human health is just a broad, high standard with regard to federal regulation of pesticides, regardless of the chemical. So again, it kind of gets back into like what's already being done and what would you be adding with Vermont specific regulations. Yeah, in terms of coming up with, I think trying to regulate food in general is a challenging goal, just because it's a multi-vector, product in terms of sourcing of things like that, which is probably one of the reasons why some of these studies and reports are a number of years out, because it's going to take a number of years to really get a good handle on it. Where the feds are with that, with PSI, I know they've been undertaking a very detailed and extensive surveying operation so far in terms of really identifying where PFAS is still being used and why is it being used and things like that, which would provide then a baseline for, well, what can and should we do in terms of federal regulations. And I don't know, it's been going on for at least a couple of years. I don't know where they are at in terms of that information gathering stage or not, but yeah, it's a very active topic for sure.
And just in terms of, well, it's not preemption, I guess, it's just from a practical standpoint. We can't dictate what is applied in another state. We can say we can't apply a pesticide here in Vermont, but to the extent that grapes and lettuce and everything else come from another state, I don't know that we could say you can't bring it into the state, but we certainly can't tell California that they can't, or Mexico or wherever. All right, thank you, Bill. All right, appreciate it. Yeah.
I have a spy that lives in Maine. That's in the agricultural world. He lives in southern Maine now, but he's from the county. And we've had little chats about this stuff and what's going on in Maine. And he said that they wrote their bill so far reaching that they've had to keep kicking it down the road. And may have something to do with the great potato storage places and products they have to use so we can eat potatoes in March and April, May, June, July, August, till the new crop comes in. I'm going to reach out to him this weekend.
Ask him if it's showing up in lobsters.
What?
Ask him if it's showing up in lobsters.
He hates lobster. He's such a weirdo. He lives half an hour from the coast and won't eat a lobster.
That's what happens if you eat too much. I'm sure you get.
He's got something like that.
All right. We're gonna switch gears. I think we'll just, since we're running a minute or two late here, we'll just keep going if committee's okay with that. Feels like we just had a break. So we'll just mentally switch gears to S323, which is the Senate Miscellaneous Ag Bill. There are a couple of sections there that we heard about from Ledge Council that deal with the Economic Development Authority. So happy to have the Chief Executive Officer of VEDA in, Joan. Welcome.
Hi.
And you brought some guests along.
Yes.
And if you find yourselves wanting to have the 2 or 3 of you up at the same time at the end of the table, we can accommodate that.
That'll be great. Yeah.
got an extra chair right to your left there, Joan, and then that folding chair too would work.
And this one here?
Yeah. If you should.
We're not careful, Chair, they're gonna outnumber us.
We are short a couple of committee members. We're already a small, you've been here before. We're not a big committee.
I don't think I've ever testified in this committee, so
Okay, well, welcome.
it'd be great.
I get that.
Oh, excellent. Look at that.
Just trying to get it ready.
Well, so we did have a walkthrough with legislative council on this section, and I think the agency, to be perfectly honest, I've lost track of whether the agency came in and made the case. I think they did, but we wanted to hear directly from you too.
Absolutely, and that's great. Thank you for the opportunity. For the record, Joan Goldstein, CEO of Vita. With me is,
Oh, Jennifer Emmons Butler, I'm the Chief Legal Officer at VEDA.
and
Andy Wood, Director of Agricultural Lending.
so I thought since I hadn't presented, maybe my predecessor presented to the committee, we would do a little brief review of what is VEDA, and then we could talk about what the changes are. So Vermont Economic Development Authority was created in 1974, so we're 51 years old. And our mission is simply to create economic vitality. That takes the form of a broad array of financing programs to eligible businesses that create jobs and help advance Vermont's public policy goals. Since its inception, we've provided more than 2.8 billion in financing assistance, and that's not just to businesses and manufacturers, but also agricultural enterprises to enhance the vitality. Now, VACC is Vermont Agricultural Credit Program, created by the General Assembly in 1999. And it was created to incorporate VAC, even though the VEDA Board of Directors and the VAC board are one and the same. The people who work for VEDA are also people who work for VAC. So we're really one and the same. And when we look back to understand why was it created, the belief that there was an appropriation that started it, and not every farm was able to get credit from banks. And so VEDA was brought in, VAC was brought in to play that role. And so, the fact of that, I should say, so VEDA is an instrumentality of the state, which basically we're not a state agency, but the governor appoints the board of directors. And there's also some ex officios who are kind of like Agency of Agriculture Secretary, the Agency of Commerce Secretary, a few ex officio roles, the state treasurer. So how do we get our money? We no longer are asking for appropriations. We are getting some appropriations if there's a specific program. For example, last year we got $2 million from the state to help with disaster recovery. But generally, we issue debt, we issue commercial paper. We also have lines of credit. We have, for the agricultural lending, we have CoBank as our source of agricultural line of credit. So we borrow money and then we lend it out into the marketplace to fulfill our mission. Fiscal year 25, which is the most recent year, these are some of the figures, 61 million in new loans. That's 173 loans closed. The agricultural piece was $15 million out of that. We also do some of the state revolving loan funds for water and wastewater improvement. And then we have a commercial side that includes energy, manufacturing, and hospitality. To look at the whole portfolio, it gives you a glimpse into, we've got 553 loans in the agricultural portfolio, but that's representing, that's helping 286 farms. So it's not unusual that farms and forestry entities have more than one loan with us. And the breakdown is, there's dairy is still the largest component of that lending, less than it used to be, only because of the diversification of farms, and this reflects that as well. There's beef, equine, forestry, fruit, hay, crops, poultry, so that it's gotten more diversified than in the past. The way we break it down is we are the direct lender to farmers and forestry, forest products enterprises, which is separate from the way we work on the commercial side. On the commercial side, we usually take the subordinated position, which means we're second after a primary bank. But for agriculture, we're the primary lender in most cases. Occasionally, there may be some other lenders, but frequently we're the only one involved in a project. They include expansions, land acquisition, equipment purchases, working capital, housing for farmers and farm workers. So it's a very broad array. Some names that you might be familiar with: Stewart Maple, Animal Hospital, Equine Rescue, Mushrooms, Logging, and 2 farms that I mentioned, but we have many more. And then just some other historical Vita investments. We were there at the very beginning with Ben and Jerry's, other farms like Pete Green's, Black River Produce, Cabot Creamery. So get to the language. So what happens when we have this separate entity of VAC? We have to do kind of this like administrative hurdles of separate board meetings. We have to borrow money from Vita in order to pay payroll, even though we're all the same people. So it just adds administrative heft to something that it stopped really having a reason to exist. So we want to incorporate the VAC language, all those powers for us to lend primarily to farmers, into the existing VA statute and remove the references to any of the FSA limits. FSA is the Farm Service Agency, and we've hardly doing the guarantees that they provide. We're not doing them as frequently as in the past, so we don't want to have that limitation on our lending. We're also removing references to the Agricultural Credit Development Fund, and I'm not sure of the history on that, but yeah, so basically we're going to maintain our unwavering devotion to agriculture. We could streamline our operations, stop at the busy work with separate board meetings and separate payroll and funding of loans. So just to ease the administration, there should be no impact on borrowers or potential borrowers. We have 5 lenders. I'm like question because Andy is a manager, but also a lender as well. 5 lenders, 4 credit analysts that are committed to specifically agricultural enterprise and forestry enterprises. That's all I have, but I'm open to questions and clarifications.
Good, thank you. Questions, Representative Lipsky?
Yeah, Joan, thank you. And I've worked with FPR and PLC in the last few years. I want to thank you for including forest operations. Particularly, there was a push because of some of the flooding we had in 23 and 24, to still keep the essential food chain going for forest products. I believe Vita advanced a very attractive program for low impact, low ground pressure, more
Yes.
environmentally appropriate investments.
Yes.
So I thank you for that. But we've also, now I'm wearing a lender hat,
Okay.
where we've seen the collapse in markets, loss of processing markets regionally, and from Maine to New York,
Mhm.
and even, and then tariffs that have impacted the viability, this financial viability of some of these operations. So as a lender, and you also discounted rates for acquisition of both new and used
Yes.
equipment, which was remarkable. But the industry seems to be a place where people are afraid to borrow or invest.
Yeah.
So as lenders, how do you consider the current market conditions when you might consider?
Yeah. I mean, at first we were concerned on the milk price. Now there's a
And it
whole
goes to
host of
agriculture,
concerns.
too.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I
Speak
mean,
to it.
it's definitely, the forest industry is a dynamic industry, as so many are. We rely a lot on the strength of the businesses coming in. Their ability to manage in the past is a very strong indicator of their ability to manage in the future. Now, the situations in which they're managing change, but we look a lot at that indication. In those instances where we don't have that, we may look at what their relationships are. Different segments of the state have very different realities of what the forest products look like. Have different contracts, different sites where they're able to harvest timber. And so we try to look at it holistically. A lot of these, fortunately, are equipment-backed loans and things of those nature where collateral does help to mitigate some of those risks, where we're not looking at wood products or other things of that nature as our collateral. But it starts with that historic business performance and ability to manage through past challenging times.
The low rate, if I could just add on, the special equipment was made available through funding from the state. So that really helps when I think it was 500,000 came over from FP&R. I think it was something to do with clean water. They took some excess. And so that helps us tremendously to be able to lower our rate. Otherwise, we'd have to lend at our market rate.
Right, and I think for people in this committee that have been in this business a long time, historically, if you went to a commercial bank, Farm Credit East was a little more familiar, but local banks, their doors were closed to loggers. There's a historic risk. It was more than they could handle.
Yeah.
But they would want to see what are your last 3 tax returns versus Andy, you talked about credit, character, collateral, cash, meaning some down payment, which were standard, benchmarks for commercial lending. Those were all out the window, other than I want your last 3 years tax returns.
Yeah.
If they didn't hold up,
Yeah.
you had no access to them. Okay, thank you.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you. So CoBank is one of your primary sources of money out of Denver. And was that fostered when Dean Morrow left Yankee Farm Credit and went to be president of CoBank?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know that we've had the relationship with them for a long time. So
Yeah.
I don't know when that was, but
Dean Morrow ran Yankee Farm Credit here, a great man. And
It would not surprise me. I know that there was an individual that was instrumental in that move and in that setup, but we don't have the details of who that was right now.
yeah, and what are your rates? Are they the same as commercial rates now, or are you point or so below it because you don't have to answer your?
we're definitely below the banks. We're definitely below the banks. Combination of what I just mentioned on this special money, but also the strength of our balance sheet. We've been able to discount some rates. So on average, about 1% below market.
Big
Yeah,
today.
yeah.
All right, well, I, as a farmer and, over the years, our farmers had different loans through Vita or whatnot, of course, a lot with Yankee Farm Credit and then Farm Credit East and CoBank and Compier. Yeah, I was a little concerned when I first heard this, but now learning more about, just it's cleaning up your house and making you leaner and more efficient, and that's probably a good move.
Representative O'Brien.
Was this the legislation that also referenced the Vermont Jobs Fund? Is that in this?
I don't, did it come up in
There
this?
is some reference in the statute to the jobs fund because it's in the VITA statute, and there was one change where there was $100 million that it was basically borrowing from ourselves because we use the same jobs fund. And so if we do collapse the entities into one, we don't need a separate line item. We don't actually use it anyway because we haven't had appropriations in so long, but it's basically the fund that we use to fund all of our projects. So we don't need a separate line item for VAC.
Okay, because we were confused about Vermont Sustainable Jobs.
Right.
I asked Ellen and she said, No, it's not the same thing, but even more confusing is that Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund started at Vita
Yeah,
way back. And
Yeah,
then
it's
they went
interesting.
out on their own after that, so.
And even more confusing, there's the Vermont Sustainable Job Strategy, which is another section of the FEMA statute, but they're
we'll
all
have
quite
to
different.
clean up
Yes,
the
yes.
statute.
It might
in
need
its
a little
entirety
cleanup,
at some
yes.
point, but not this year.
The idea was to simplify the changes
Yeah.
and not make any substantive changes
Right.
except to put the agricultural credit program into the VITA statute without changing any of the ways of how it works.
Because otherwise we also, I forgot to mention separate documentation, the documents are different and.
It's confusing
So-
to borrowers too. We've made a conscious effort over the years to call ourselves VITA so that it wouldn't be a surprise. But then if they get a payoff statement for a loan and they think it comes from VITA, and then
They're
they
like-
see the mortgage is back and it does create confusion, even though it
Yeah.
all comes from the same place. Yeah.
The S60 was passed, which is our disaster loan fund for forestry and agriculture.
Grant fund.
Yeah, grant fund. And I realize you're not in the business of writing grants, but is Vita a vehicle so in a disaster like the floods of 23 or 24 hit and a farmer needs access to capital, is Vita able to move quickly on
Yeah.
those?
Exactly. That's exactly the purpose of last year's $2 million appropriation to VITA for disaster recovery. And then we created a program so that at any time, if there's something, a disaster, even if it's not federally declared, we're able to act and we're using those funds as a loan loss reserve so that we could create many more loans than $2 million worth. So we are prepared to do that just based on that appropriation.
Perfect.
I did see S60 and I guess it's creating a special fund, but it's not funded. Is that my,
Correct.
yeah,
That's true so far.
yeah.
Representative Brian.
Is Vita funding ever used for, leveraging or match funds? Like if I had won a working, plans grant. And then I needed, say, another 40%, could I go to Vita and say this will make this full project come true?
Yes,
You're like, well, you've already.
that would be great too, because if we saw that there's grant money supporting it, that it helps the credit, so.
And we've done some bridge financing when they're waiting for a grant.
Waiting
also.
for a grant, yeah.
I mean, depending on the circumstances.
So call Andy.
That's exactly what we talked about, funding the Working Lands Initiative. And, I'd like to see matches from the receivers of these grants.
Sure.
And, if you get a 50% grant, you probably already have equity in that piece of equipment, so it makes it much easier for a lender to move forward on it. And the bridge loans are real important because you need to have the equipment before you get the.
You were right. It's section 20. The references the job fund. Yeah. Other questions? Right, we may have our friends downstairs and Economic Commerce just take a quick look at this.
Sure.
too.
Definitely.
I don't think anybody's opposed to it, as far as I know.
I haven't heard any opposition.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll get called to testify there just so that they could, be clear about what we're asking. Yeah.
All right,
All
well,
right.
thank you very much.
Thank you very
Appreciate it.
much. Thanks for having us in. Take care.
Thank you.
Tricia, I don't know if Bradley is available this morning.
I'll check with him.
Okay.
Shall I end the live stream now?
Yes, but we may come back if Bradley's available and can come right in. We may have him just quickly go through this language again. I think he went over it. Thank you. But other